A soft breeze blew through the open windows of the luxurious penthouse, carrying with it the scent of fresh flowers from the balcony garden. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, a picture of the high life. Liza Matthews leaned against the sleek kitchen counter, her fingers absently tracing the lines of the marble top. She had everything she ever wanted, or so it seemed. At 30, Liza had traded in her humble beginnings for the kind of luxury she never imagined. Her life was a dream, complete with designer clothes, private chauffeurs, and expensive dinners at the finest restaurants in London. At the heart of it all was Marcus Stevenson, a well-known and successful businessman. Marcus wasn't just rich, he was powerful. Known for loaning large sums of money to people in desperate need, Marcus was feared and admired in equal measure. He had a reputation for being ruthless with those who failed to pay him back, and it was no secret that he had destroyed lives without a second thought. But Liza, for all her ambition, had never really thought about the darker side of Marcus' business. She was too busy basking in the glow of his wealth and the lifestyle he had offered her. From the outside, their relationship seemed like a perfect match. Liza, the stunning beauty with a sharp mind, and Marcus, the wealthy and influential man, made an enviable couple. But inside, things were far more complicated. Liza had always been driven by her hunger for success, and while she enjoyed Marcus' wealth, she also resented the fact that it all belonged to him. She wanted more, something of her own. But with Marcus controlling everything, her sense of freedom was slowly suffocating. It wasn't that Liza didn't care for Marcus. In the early days, she had been captivated by his charm and the way he had swept her off her feet. He had taken her from a cramped apartment in South London to a penthouse overlooking the Thames, lavishing her with gifts and attention. But as time passed, the power dynamic in their relationship became glaringly obvious. Marcus controlled everything, from where they went to what she wore. He gave her everything, but she still felt like a possession, a beautiful accessory to his success. Then there was the business. The shadowy figures who came and went from Marcus' office in the city, the late-night phone calls, and the quiet threats he would make about people who disappeared when they couldn't repay him. Liza had seen enough to know that Marcus' business wasn't just about loans. There were deeper, darker things at play, but she had convinced herself to look the other way. After all, as long as she was benefiting, did it really matter? But as the months passed, Liza's dissatisfaction grew. She wanted something more than being just Marcus' girlfriend. She dreamed of having her own business, her own money, and her own life. And then came the temptation, the opportunity she never expected. One evening, while Marcus was out of town on business, Liza found herself wandering through his home office. She knew it was off limits, but curiosity got the better of her. She had always wondered just how much money Marcus had stashed away, how much he was really worth. With a glass of wine in hand, she sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. It was locked, but Liza knew Marcus' passwords. He had trusted her enough to share them in casual conversation. As she navigated through his financial records, her heart began to race. The amounts of money she saw were staggering, millions upon millions, all neatly organized in various accounts. And then she saw it, a transfer request waiting to be processed. It was a large sum, destined for a new investment in a real estate project. Without thinking, Liza clicked on the details. All it would take was one small change, one quick edit, and the money could be transferred elsewhere, somewhere only she would know. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. Could she really do this? Steal from Marcus? But the thought of being free, of having enough money to start her own life, was too tempting to resist. She had lived under his control for too long. With trembling fingers, she changed the details of the transfer. Within minutes, millions were on their way to an account she had set up in secret months before, an account in her name alone. Liza closed the laptop and stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. It was done. The money was hers. But even as she tried to savor the moment, a sense of dread crept over her. She knew Marcus would find out. He was too smart not to notice. She had a limited amount of time before everything would come crashing down, and when it did, there would be no escaping the consequences. In the days that followed, Liza played her part perfectly. She acted as if nothing had changed, smiling at Marcus and continuing their usual routine. But beneath the surface, she was already planning her escape. She couldn't stay in London, not with Marcus' reach stretching across the city. She needed to disappear, to start over somewhere new. It was a dangerous gamble, but Liza had always been willing to take risks. After all, she had nothing to lose, except everything. A week later, Liza was gone. She left behind no trace, no farewell note, and no explanation. She had fled to the south of France, using her newfound wealth to disappear into the world of luxury. The sun-kissed beaches, the designer boutiques, the private villas, it was everything she had ever dreamed of, and more. For the first time in her life, Liza felt truly free. She spent her days lounging by the pool, sipping champagne, and pretending that the life she had left behind didn't exist. But freedom came at a price. Even as she reveled in her new lifestyle, a gnawing fear lingered in the back of her mind. She knew Marcus would come looking for her, and when he did, it wouldn't be pretty. Liza had heard enough about what happened to people who crossed Marcus Stevenson. They didn't just disappear, they were erased. Months passed, and Liza began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had escaped. She had changed her name, her appearance, and her location. She was careful, always looking over her shoulder, but as the days turned into weeks, she started to let her guard down. Life in the French Riviera was good, and for a while, she allowed herself to believe that she had won. But Marcus hadn't forgotten. One evening, as Liza was returning to her villa after a night out in Monaco, she noticed something strange. The door to her villa was slightly ajar. Her heart skipped a beat as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. And then she saw him, sitting in the living room, his legs casually crossed, a glass of wine in his hand. Marcus. Liza's blood ran cold. She had always known this day would come, but she had never been prepared for it. Marcus looked up at her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Did you really think you could steal from me, Liza?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with menace. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. I can explain," she stammered, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Marcus stood up, setting the glass down on the table. He walked over to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "No need to explain," he said softly. "You owe me, Liza. And you're going to pay." Liza's breath caught in her throat. She had always known Marcus was ruthless, but the cold fury in his eyes terrified her. He wasn't just angry, he was vengeful. And there was no telling what he would do next. As Marcus reached out to touch her face, Liza felt the weight of her betrayal crashing down on her. She had made a terrible mistake, and now, there was no way out. "You stole from me," Marcus whispered. "Now it's time to pay up. And trust me, the price is going to be far worse than you ever imagined." Liza's heart pounded in her chest as Marcus' words echoed in her mind. She had thought she could escape, but she had been wrong. Now, she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, with no way out. And the real horror was just beginning. The air inside the villa was suffocating. Marcus paced slowly in front of the large windows, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on his tall figure. Liza stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, her mind scrambling for any possible way out. But there was none. She had stolen from him millions, and now she had to face the consequences. She knew Marcus too well. This wasn't going to end with a simple repayment plan. He wanted something far more sinister. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes cold and calculating. "You thought you could run, didn't you?" he said softly, the hint of a smile playing on his lips. "But you can't outrun me, Liza. No one does." She could barely breathe, her throat tight with fear. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was desperate." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "Desperation, huh? That's funny. I don't recall you being desperate when you were living off my money, enjoying all the luxuries I gave you." His voice was calm, but the menace in it was unmistakable. He wasn't here for apologies. "Please," Liza whispered. "I'll do anything to fix this. Just tell me what you want." Marcus's smile widened, but there was nothing warm about it. "Oh, I know you will," he said, stepping closer to her. "You see, Liza, I don't want the money back. That's the least of my concerns. I have more money than I could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. No, I want something far more valuable than cash." Her stomach twisted into knots as he spoke. She had no idea what he was getting at, but the look in his eyes made her blood run cold. "What do you want, Marcus?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek black phone. "You see," he said, holding the phone up for her to see, "I've got a new venture. A very lucrative one. I've made some friends who require, let's call it, special merchandise. And this, my dear Liza, is where you come in." Her heart pounded as he spoke, her mind spinning with confusion. "What are you talking about?" Marcus smiled again, this time with a twisted glint in his eyes. "Children," he said simply. Liza's breath caught in her throat. "Children," she echoed, her voice shaking with disbelief. "What do you mean?" He stepped even closer, until he was standing directly in front of her, towering over her small frame. "It's simple," he said. "You took something from me, and now you owe me. But instead of paying me back with money, you're going to pay me back with something else. Body parts. Children's body parts, to be exact." Liza's world shattered in that moment. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed against the wall, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, no, no," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I can't do that. I won't do that." Marcus grabbed her chin, forcing her to look up at him. "You don't have a choice," he said coldly. "I'm not asking you, Liza. I'm telling you. You either do this, or you disappear. Permanently." She felt like she was going to be sick. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. How had her life spiraled so far out of control? She had made a terrible mistake, but this was monstrous. "Marcus, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "There has to be another way." He let go of her chin and stepped back, his face hardening. "There is no other way. You wanted to be free of me, right? Well, here's your chance. Do what I say for 1 year, and after that, you can walk away. You can have the money. You can have everything you stole, plus more. But if you refuse..." He let the threat hang in the air, unspoken but perfectly clear. Liza sobbed, covering her face with her hands. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could she ever agree to something so vile, so evil? But what choice did she have? Marcus was right, he had the power to make her disappear, and no one would ever know what happened to her. She had seen firsthand how easily he could destroy lives. And now, her life was in his hands. 1 year, she whispered, her voice broken. And then I'm free. Marcus smiled again, the same cold, calculating smile that made her feel like prey. 1 year, he confirmed. But you better make sure you don't screw this up, Liza. Because if you do, there's no coming back. The next day, Marcus laid out the details of the gruesome arrangement. He introduced her to his business partners, men with cold, lifeless eyes and cruel smiles. They discussed logistics, the specifics of what would be required. Liza could barely process it all, her mind reeling from the horror of it. But Marcus had made it clear, there was no turning back. The plan was simple, in its own twisted way. Liza would run a high-end restaurant in an affluent area of London, one that catered to an elite clientele. But behind the scenes, she would be sourcing the special ingredients that Marcus and his associates needed. The children's body parts would be discreetly transported, some for Marcus' mysterious clients and others for Liza's restaurant. It was a sick, twisted operation, one that made her feel like she was descending into a nightmare. Liza had no idea how she was going to live with herself. The first time she saw the merchandise delivered to the restaurant's back door, she vomited, her body shaking with revulsion. But Marcus was always there, watching her, making sure she followed through. He made it clear that she couldn't back out now. She had to do it, or her life, and possibly the lives of those she cared about, would be forfeit. Weeks turned into months, and Liza became numb to the horror of her new life. She learned how to run the restaurant like a well-oiled machine, presenting an air of elegance and sophistication to the world while hiding the monstrous truth. The clientele adored her food, raving about the exotic dishes she served, blissfully unaware of the true cost behind their meals. But the toll on her soul was unbearable. Every day, she felt like she was losing a piece of herself, slipping further into darkness. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, and she could no longer look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgusted. Marcus, of course, was thriving. His operation was growing, and he was making more money than ever. He would visit the restaurant often, checking in on her, reminding her of the deal they had made. He never let her forget that she was trapped, that she had no choice but to continue the horrific work he had forced upon her. 1 year. That's what he had promised her. But as the months dragged on, Liza began to doubt whether she would even make it that long. The weight of her guilt was crushing her, and the nightmares that haunted her every night were becoming unbearable. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The faces of the children she had helped to destroy haunted her constantly, their innocent eyes staring back at her in silent accusation. She had made a deal with the devil, and now she was paying the ultimate price. As the year drew to a close, Liza found herself at a breaking point. She couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't live with the guilt, the horror, the lies. She had tried to rationalize it, telling herself that she had no choice, that Marcus had forced her into this. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had made the decision to steal from him, to betray him. And now, she was paying for it in the most horrific way imaginable. One evening, after closing the restaurant, Liza sat alone in her office, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. It had been exactly 11 months since she had made the deal with Marcus. In 1 month, she would be free, or so he had promised. But Liza didn't believe it anymore. She knew that even if Marcus kept his word, she would never truly be free. The guilt, the shame, the horror of what she had done would follow her for the rest of her life. Tears streamed down her face as she picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in over a year. 911, what's your emergency? Came the calm voice on the other end. Liza took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. I need to report a crime, she said. A terrible, terrible crime. The weight of her guilt, her fear, her shame, all of it came crashing down on her in that moment. She had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain. The nightmare was finally over. Liza sat on the hard, cold bench in the police interrogation room, her hands trembling as they rested in her lap. The stark white walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating her with their coldness. It had been hours since she'd walked into the station and confessed to everything, every sickening detail of the past year. She had expected immediate judgment, immediate condemnation, but instead, the officers had looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and horror. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every second felt like an eternity. She had done it, she had finally broken free of Marcus's twisted grip, but the cost was far greater than she had ever anticipated. Now, she had to face the consequences. There would be no escaping the weight of what she had done. The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and a detective stepped inside, a stern look on his face. His eyes bore into hers as he sat down across from her, a thick file in his hands. Liza felt the bile rise in her throat as she realized what was about to happen. "Miss Matthews," the detective began, his voice low but firm, "you understand the gravity of the charges you've confessed to, correct?" Liza nodded weakly, her voice barely audible. "I do." He opened the file and flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the documents. "According to your statement, you've been involved in a criminal operation that includes trafficking children's body parts. Is that correct?" Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't bring herself to answer. The words felt like acid on her tongue. She had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken out loud was almost unbearable. "Yes," she whispered. "That's correct." The detective's eyes darkened, and he leaned back in his chair, studying her closely. "What made you come forward now? After a year of doing this?" Liza felt the tears welling up again, her guilt threatening to swallow her whole. How could she explain the torment that had consumed her for the past year? The nightmares, the crushing guilt, the way her soul had withered under the weight of her actions. She had been living in a hell of her own making, and now, finally, she was trying to claw her way out. "I couldn't take it anymore," she said, her voice shaking. "The guilt, the shame, it's been eating away at me. I know what I did was wrong, and I'm willing to face the consequences. But I had to stop. I had to stop it before more lives were destroyed." The detective sighed and closed the file, his expression softening just a fraction. "You should know that what you've admitted to is serious, very serious. We're talking about multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and human trafficking. You'll be facing life in prison, at the very least." Liza nodded again, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. Life in prison. It seemed fitting, after everything she had done. She had no illusions about escaping the punishment she deserved. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had made her decision, and now she would face the consequences, no matter how harsh. "There's one more thing," the detective said, leaning forward slightly. "Marcus Stevenson. You say he orchestrated this whole operation?" Liza's stomach churned at the mention of Marcus's name. Even now, the thought of him filled her with fear and dread. He was still out there, and she knew that as long as he remained free, more lives would be ruined. He was a master manipulator, and if she didn't give the police what they needed, he would continue to thrive in the shadows, untouchable. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "Marcus is the one behind all of it. He forced me into this. He threatened to kill me if I didn't comply. He's the one who arranged for the children to be taken. He sold their body parts to his clients, and I was forced to serve them in the restaurant." The detective's eyes narrowed, and he scribbled down notes as she spoke. "We've been after Stevenson for a long time," he said. "But he's careful, never leaves any evidence that can be traced back to him. If what you're saying is true, you could be our key witness. But you need to give us something solid, something that will hold up in court. Liza's mind raced. She had seen enough over the past year to know exactly how Marcus operated, where the money went, who the clients were. But the thought of testifying against him filled her with terror. Marcus wasn't just powerful, he was dangerous. If he found out she had turned on him, he wouldn't hesitate to have her killed. Even from behind bars, he would find a way. But what choice did she have? If she didn't speak up, more children would die. More lives would be destroyed. And she would be complicit in all of it. "I'll tell you everything," Liza said, her voice steady. "I'll give you the names, the accounts, the locations. But you need to protect me. Marcus, he won't let this go. He'll come after me. You have to promise that you'll keep me safe." The detective nodded. "We'll do everything we can to ensure your safety. But you need to cooperate fully. No half-truths, no holding back. If we're going to take Marcus down, we need it all." Liza took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had no idea if she would survive this, but one thing was certain, she couldn't keep running. The time for hiding was over. The next few weeks were a blur of interviews, court filings, and endless meetings with lawyers and detectives. Liza recounted every detail of the operation, how Marcus had lured her into the scheme, how he had threatened her life, how he had orchestrated the trafficking of children. It was excruciating, reliving the nightmare day after day, but she knew it had to be done. The more she shared, the more determined the investigators became to bring Marcus down. In the meantime, Liza was placed in protective custody, moved to a safe house far from London. The authorities promised that she would be safe, that Marcus wouldn't be able to find her. But no matter how many assurances they gave her, Liza never felt truly secure. Marcus had connections everywhere. He could easily reach her, even behind locked doors. As the trial date approached, the media caught wind of the case. Headlines screamed about the luxury restaurant scandal, the black market body parts, and the ruthless kingpin behind it all. Liza's name was dragged through the mud, her face plastered on every front page as the woman who served death on a plate. She tried to block it all out, to focus on the goal, bringing Marcus to justice. But the shame, the guilt, the knowledge that she had been a willing participant in such horrors, those things she couldn't escape. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. The day of the trial was a storm of nerves and fear. Liza sat in the witness stand, her hands shaking as she clutched the edges of the wooden platform. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, the cameras clicking from the press gallery. But none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was Marcus. He sat at the defense table, his face an unreadable mask of calm. He looked as powerful and untouchable as ever, even in his tailored suit, despite the chains binding his wrists. When their eyes met, a chill ran down Liza's spine. There was no remorse in his gaze, no fear. Only cold calculation. The prosecutor began to question her, guiding her through the details of her testimony. Liza answered each question as best she could, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. She told the court about how Marcus had manipulated her, how he had used fear and intimidation to force her into his scheme. She described the operation in brutal detail, the clients, the body parts, the hidden accounts. She left nothing out. As she spoke, she could feel the weight of the jury's judgment bearing down on her. They were disgusted by what she had done, she could see it in their eyes. But she had expected that. What mattered now was whether they believed her, whether they saw her as a victim or a criminal in her own right. When the prosecutor finally stepped back, the defense attorney rose. His eyes gleamed as he approached the stand, ready to tear her testimony apart. Liza braced herself for the onslaught. "Ms. Matthews," the attorney began, his voice smooth and condescending, "you claim that Mr. Stevenson forced you into this criminal enterprise. That you had no choice. But isn't it true that you willingly participated in his lifestyle for years? That you enjoyed the luxury, the money, the power that came with being his partner?" Liza swallowed hard, her heart racing. She had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I did enjoy it at first. But I didn't know what he was involved in. Not until it was too late." The attorney smiled, a predator sensing weakness. "And yet, even after you discovered the truth, you continued to participate. For a full year, you served his clients in that restaurant. You could have walked away at any time. Why didn't you?" Liza felt the walls closing in around her. She had no good answer for that. The truth was, she had stayed out of fear, out of greed, out of a sick hope that she could somehow escape unscathed. But there was no escaping this now. "I was afraid," she said, her voice cracking. "I was terrified of what Marcus would do to me if I didn't comply. He threatened my life. He would have killed me." The attorney nodded, but his smile never faltered. "And yet, you never went to the police. You never sought help. Instead, you chose to profit from his crimes, didn't you?" Liza's throat tightened. "I made a terrible mistake," she whispered. "I regret everything I did. But I'm trying to make it right now." The attorney leaned closer, his voice low and menacing. "Is it because you regret it, Ms. Matthews, or is it because you got caught?" The courtroom fell silent. Liza felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She had no answer. Because, in truth, it was both. She regretted everything, but she had also been caught. And now, there was no turning back. The trial dragged on for weeks, but in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Stevenson was found guilty on all counts: human trafficking, murder, conspiracy. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Liza, too, faced her judgment. While the court acknowledged her cooperation and her testimony against Marcus, it couldn't overlook the fact that she had been a willing participant in his crimes. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison for her role in the operation, with the possibility of parole after 15. As the gavel fell, sealing her fate, Liza felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. But the weight of her guilt, her shame, her regret, that would never leave her. She would carry it with her for the rest of her life. And no amount of luxury or freedom could ever erase that.